home. Home. When I say that word, what comes to your mind? What emotions do you have? How do you feel when you hear the word? I asked the Bible study class on Wednesday night that question, to just say what comes to mind when you hear the word, and they said things like love, warmth, welcome. It's the place where if you're not there, somebody misses you. It's a place of acceptance. Home means safety, security. Those are the kinds of words that they used to describe how they felt and what their thoughts were when they heard the word home. Perhaps the word yearning comes to mind too. A yearning for home. It's that experience that we find with the people of God in exile in the Hebrew Scriptures. That yearning for home. As Reverend McDermott said a moment ago, the people have been exiled. It's called sometimes the Babylonian captivity. Babylon has taken them and exiled them from all that is familiar, from Zion, a word that describes a place, but it's not just a place, it's home. It's the place where even God resides in a special way, because it's the place of the temple, it's Jerusalem, it's home, Zion. And that experience of exile is captured powerfully in the 137th Psalm, where the psalmist says, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. And there we hung up our lyres in the trees, our musical instruments in the trees, because they demanded of us a song of joy. Sing one of the songs of Zion," they said. But how could we sing? How could we sing in a foreign land? Do you feel it? The yearning for home. You turn over to the pages of the New Testament and you find there Jesus' story of the prodigal son, we call it generally. It's perhaps the best known parable of Jesus. And there we find in the midst of that story a man in exile. He has exiled himself. He has gone into a far country, it says, a land far away from home. He's wasted everything. He's found himself destitute, doing the worst kind of work that one could imagine, especially for a Jewish boy, because he's slopping hogs. He's feeding those unclean, unkosher animals, and he's yearning even to eat the slop that they're eating. He is so hungry. What's he yearning for? Home. Can you feel that? In those seasons in our lives when we feel disconnected from God, in those times when we feel alienated from meaning and purpose, when we have a kind of flatness of spirit, what are we missing? Home. Can you feel that? And this is not a concept that just comes into play in the Hebrew Scriptures later on in the prophet Jeremiah, but even back in Genesis. When the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, are banished from the garden that represents security and plenty, that is for them their home, a home that was created for them. and yet they are banished from it to live in the land of Nod, east of Eden, for the rest of their lives. And in a sense, we all live in that land of Nod, east of Eden, outside the garden, yearning for home. Now, it's to those people in exile that Jeremiah writes. And what he says to them is, you know how over and over again we have looked back at the great salvation event of being set free from Egypt, of being set free from slavery, of being free of captivity. That's salvation. It's the primary salvation event in the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's one everybody could rehearse. And in fact, throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, over and over again, the story is told, as we saw a couple of weeks ago. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt and set you free. Over and over again, the story is told. But Jeremiah says to these people who are in exile, that's the story we've told about what God has done in the past. Over and over, you have heard the story over and over, but God is doing a new thing. There is another chapter of salvation, and that is the return home from exile. And so he says, from now on, there will be a new story that'll be told. And it's the story of how God brought you out of exile and brought you back home. It's that story of returning home that is a salvation story, not just in the Hebrew Scriptures, but it's a salvation story in the New Testament as well. Because Jesus, according to the Gospel of John particularly, Jesus shows us what God is like. John says, no one has ever seen the Father, but it is the Son who is close to the heart of the Father that's made him known. And Jesus makes known the nature of God in his teaching, in his parable, in his life, death, and resurrection. In Jesus, we see what God is like. And Jesus tells this story. And it's a story about God. And it's a story about salvation. It is a story of returning home. There is this younger son. There are two brothers. The younger son is restless. The younger son believes that if he just has a change of scenery, that if he goes someplace else, everything will be different. Everything will be better. His life will be different in another place. Have you ever thought that? If I just had so-and-so, life would be better. If I had a different job, life would be better. If I just moved to another place, everything would be instantly okay. But I've learned, and perhaps you've learned it too, that, well, as one person put it, wherever I go, there I am again. Yeah, most problems are portable, aren't they? We take them with us. We find that going someplace else does not fix our issues. Oh, sometimes it can, of course. I mean, if we're in dire circumstances, we have to get out of those circumstances, perhaps even something horrific like abuse. We've got to get out of that. But what about that sense of restlessness that somehow, whatever's going on with me, whatever alienation I feel from God, whatever alienation I feel from meaning and purpose in my life, if I just do that, or if I just acquire that, then it'll fix it. But generally that doesn't work out very well. And so we take a journey, and sometimes that journey will take us into a far country, and when we return home, we're different. We're different. Well, that's the story of the prodigal son. He yearns to get away. He yearns to have a new life, something different, out from under the burden of his chores or whatever it is at home that he wants to leave. And so he demands his inheritance. What he's really saying to his father is, you're not dead yet. It'd be nice if you were, so I could go ahead and get my inheritance. But you're not dead, so go ahead and give me what's coming to me now. I mean, he burns a bridge with his father, doesn't he? He humiliates, he embarrasses his father. He brings shame on the household by demanding his inheritance and going into a far country, far away. And there he squanders everything. He takes himself with him. This prodigal. The word prodigal means wastefully, recklessly extravagant. He's just had a lot of restriction at home. He hasn't been able to act on that, but now he's wastefully, recklessly extravagant. And when the money dries up and all the fair weather friends are gone, he's slopping hogs, the worst kind of work one could imagine, and he's in despair. And then he takes the longest journey of all. Jesus says he came to himself. Or the Common English Bible we heard a moment ago says he came to his senses. Do you know that can be the longest journey of all? Coming to yourself, coming to your senses. He came to that place when he realized that it was time to go home. But the problem was he had burned all these bridges. The problem was that he did not deserve to go home. He didn't deserve to be accepted back. He knew that. He had disgraced his father. He had disgraced the family. He had wasted all that his father had worked hard to gain. He didn't deserve to be welcomed back, but he had a plan, and that was maybe his father would take him back as a hired servant. That is the lowest rung on the farm. This is a person with no job security. This is a person who is like a day laborer, one day at a time, hired servant. Whether he'll have a job tomorrow or not, who knows? And he's hoping maybe he can get that position on the farm. And so he rehearses his speech. Father, I've sinned against you. I've sinned against God. Will you take me back as one of your hired servants? And all the way home, he is rehearsing his speech. Meanwhile, the father goes every day and looks down the road as far as he can see to see if maybe today is the day the son will return home. It is the picture of someone yearning for reconciliation, yearning for the son to come home. It is the picture of love. One day, he sees him while he is yet far off, it says, and he does something that was embarrassing and humiliating in that culture. It's hard to imagine that now. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is. In that culture, it's a big deal for a man to run. You just don't do it. It's undignified. The robes flapping, perhaps even exposing too much of the body. It's just not done. But the father runs while the son is yet far off, and he embraces him. And then he gives him all the symbols of being a part of the family, the ring and the robe and the shoes. And he has a feast that almost never happens. I mean, a big feast would be to kill a goat and feast on that, but he kills the fatted calf. That's a big deal. And he has a big party, and he welcomes him home. Some have said that this parable is misnamed. It should be called the parable of the loving father. I think a better name is even the parable of the prodigal father, because the word prodigal means wastefully, recklessly, extravagant, and that's exactly what the father is like. He is wastefully, recklessly extravagant in his love for his son, for his precious child. I mean, recklessly, wastefully extravagant. The fatted calf, the ring, the robe, the shoes, and all of this for this boy who didn't deserve any of it. And he welcomes him home in that way. And Jesus is saying that is what God is like. It doesn't matter what you've done, where you've been. God waits to welcome you home, and salvation is returning home. Returning to that place where there is meaning and purpose and safety and security and love and acceptance. And that's what the relationship with God is like. Jesus is teaching us. It's a wonderful scene. But unfortunately, it's not the end of the story. There's another character, and that's the elder brother. The elder brother who is a rule follower. He has followed all the rules. He's done everything he's supposed to do. See, Jesus tells this parable in response to the scribes and Pharisees who are complaining that Jesus is eating and drinking with sinners. By the way, Luke uses that phrase all the time. Jesus is always doing that. He's eating and drinking with sinners. He's partying with the wrong kind of people, and they're criticizing him. And Jesus tells this parable in response to that criticism. This elder brother is like that. He's a rule follower, and he expects the rules to be followed. And one of the rules is that a prodigal, if you welcome him home at all, is to be welcomed home in sackcloth and ashes, not with a robe and a ring and a fatted calf and shoes. So he is angry. He can't believe how prodigal his father is. And so he says to the father, "This son of yours went and wasted everything. And you have never even as much as killed a goat to give me a party with my friends, and yet you kill the fatted calf for this guy, your son." And the father responds, "My son, you've always been with me, and everything that I have is yours." See, the elder brother is operating on this notion of scarcity. There's not enough love to go around. There's not enough to go around. He's afraid there's not enough, and so can't give any of that to this prodigal. "My son, everything I have is yours," and it's true. The other son's already gotten his inheritance. "You've always been with me." But it's fitting that we have this big feast because your brother, he doesn't let him get away with that your son stuff. He reminds him, no, this is your brother. Your brother was lost and is found. He was dead, now he's alive. We have to have this feast. It is in the very nature of the Father to do this. We have to do it. And so they have this celebration, and the elder son is furious and refuses to go in. And the story ends there. You know, it may be this morning that you're feeling, well, you know, I feel at home. I don't feel alienated, and that's great. I mean, we have those seasons in our lives where everything is wonderful. We feel close to God. Those are those seasons of really feasting on that relationship and feeling fed and feeling very much at home with God and with the world. Everything's good. And if that's the case, then it might be good for us to take a look at that elder brother and wonder, does that elder brother have something to teach? Because if you're at home and you've never left and everything is good and you're feeling really good about how things are, then perhaps the question is, what about the prodigals around? I've wondered if the only person home when the prodigal returned was the elder brother. Maybe the father had gone to the marketplace to make a deal on selling some crops or something, and the prodigal returns and the elder brother is there to greet him. How would that have gone? You can imagine the elder brother would have said, "You're not welcome here. This is no longer your home. You have wasted it all. You've embarrassed us. You're not welcome in this place." That's kind of a scary thought. And yet it is a thought that challenges us, because who represents the loving Father in our world today? Well, it's really those who are home in one sense or another. Those in relationship with God, those who are doing pretty well. How do we How do we welcome the prodigal? Well, the challenge of this parable is to participate in the salvation work of God today, to be participants in that, not only to be recipients of God's salvation, of God's bringing us home, but to be not like the elder brother, but to be like God. Sometimes when you listen to people talk today with so much fear and so much anxiety and this notion of scarcity and there's not enough, and if you listen, some of the words that are being said sound a lot like the elder brother, don't they? Sometimes I can hear words like that coming from my own mouth. Can you? And yet our call is to be participants in this salvation work of God and to be more and more like God in the way we treat our brothers and sisters. Not just God's children, but our brothers and sisters as well. And so the call for us is to return home. And we often find ourselves in those other places. There are aspects of our lives where we are distant from God. There are parts of our lives that we keep hidden from God. We're concerned, perhaps, that there's not enough to go around, and so we grab and hold on. And yet we have a prodigal God, recklessly, wastefully extravagant in love and grace, yearning for us to be in relationship with God, and yearning for us to be alongside God to welcome those who have been in a far country. There is a prayer that I'm going to use for our pastoral prayer today. It's written by Steve Garnis Holmes, who is a wonderful writer. He's a pastor up in the Northeast. And this prayer, I think, expresses so much of what we imagine when we think about salvation as returning home, and of what that means in really concrete ways in our lives, how we live our lives, how we receive, and how we give. So I want to read his prayer. I invite us all to make this prayer our own as I read his words. And I invite us to go with these words as we go from this place. Let's pray. O prodigal God, wastefully loving, recklessly extravagant with grace, excessively generous with forgiveness, liberal with tender mercy and compassion, lavish with hope and delight. You shower us with love that we're not prepared to receive. You know the hurt beneath our fleeing, the fear enclosed in our anger, and our clutching of what is deserved. You embrace us freely and passionately, free from our past, knowing and healing our pain, in the present moment, celebrating. You have recklessly given us your love. May we spread it wantonly, give it all away, spend it on the unlovely, waste it on the unworthy. May we set aside our pride and practice delight. May we claim again the siblings we have spurned and gladly celebrate those we've excluded. May we offer hospitality to the unlovely, forgive where it is unwarranted, and love when it is unreasonable. In your love, may we love lavishly, without exception or measurement. Yes, it will break our hearts. We shall be taken advantage of, and worse, we shall be crucified. And only your love will remain. And then For us who have died and are alive again, you will give a great feast. By your grace, may this life be a reunion, a celebration, a resurrection, that in prodigal love we may know your joy, your giving, dancing, feasting, running, embracing joy.